Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Imitation Democracy, The Development of Russia's Post-Soviet Political System, by Dmitrii Furman, narrated by Rich Miller. Foreword. Keith Gesson. I first started reading Dmitrii Furman while living in Moscow in 2008, after seeing a discussion of his work in an essay on Russia by Perry Anderson. I was immediately charmed and amazed. Furman, born in 1943, was part of the generation of intellectuals who had cheered on the fall of communism and then watched as much of the former Soviet Union descended into anarchy and despair. Many in his generation of Russian liberals had thrown in their lot with the 1990s reforms, and in the aftermath of their failure had become crabby and defensive, blaming everyone but themselves. Others had retreated into their academic disciplines, focusing on Tolstoy or Byzantium. Still others had taken up academic posts in the West. Furman moved in the exact opposite direction. During the Soviet era, he had been a comparativist scholar of religions, had written books on highly obscure topics, but perestroika pulled him into his country's present. In the post-Soviet era, he started producing a series of books and articles on the political development of the states of what had once been the Soviet Union. He was funny, shrewd, and morally unforgiving. He cleared away a vast edifice of selective memory and self-justification. He was unlike any Russian political observer that I had read. The thing that Furman did, which others of his time and place for various reasons failed to do, was look at the other post-Soviet states, at Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Kazakhstan, the Baltics. From this vantage, one could see that Russia, for all its uniqueness, was far from unique. Somehow or other, while some of the post-Soviet states had established stable democracies, and others had established unstable ones, a select few, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Russia, had established what Furman called imitation democracies. To varying degrees, the imitation democracies carried out the rituals of democracy and paid lip service to the will of the people, but actually gave the voters no real choice. Furman was not alone in defining a number of states in this way. The same period gave us the concept of competitive authoritarianism, and one theorist inside the Kremlin had even come up with the clunky term sovereign democracy. But Furman's insight was about the instability of these regimes. This instability came to the fore during elections. It was alleged electoral fraud in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan that brought about the Rose and Orange and Tulip revolutions in those countries in 2003 and 2004 and 2005. And in the coming years, disputed elections would cause massive protests in a number of post-Soviet states, including Russia in 2011 and much later Belarus in 2020 to 2021. Though the authorities knew that elections were fake, and though voters basically knew the same, somehow the simple act of going through with the ritual could sometimes infuse elections with meaning. Like many of Furman's observations, this one was both shrewd and useful. Furman was unique among his liberal contemporaries for the absolute moral clarity with which he saw 1990s Russian liberalism. The story as it was told at the time, and even now to some extent, was that the reforms were never given a chance, that Russian democracy was strangled in its cradle by Vladimir Putin and the resurgent KGB. Yeltsin, to many, remained a romantic figure, flawed but heroic, the man who stood on a tank to put the final nail into the Soviet Union. The real villain was Putin, whom Yeltsin had mistakenly entrusted with power when he should have chosen someone else. Furman saw through this. For one thing, he writes, Yeltsin, in comparative perspective, was hardly the dissident that he came to seem in the last few years of Soviet power. Looking at the other post-Soviet states, Furman notes that some, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, simply transitioned their first secretaries into the presidency. But others, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Georgia, elected actual former anti-communist dissidents, people who had spent time in prison under the communists. Russia did something in between. Yeltsin was a member of the Politburo who had fallen out of favor and rebelled against the leadership. A kind of rebel angel of communism, he seemed to many Russian anti-communists like the best of both worlds. As it turned out, this was not the case. The problem, for Furman, was that the democratic movement which came to power in Russia in 1991 was always a minority inside the country. Yeltsin himself was briefly very popular, but the programs of reforms and the dismantling of the USSR never had majority support. That did not mean it could not win. It could win, and it did. A vigorous, powerful minority, Furman writes, with a fortuitous leader, Yeltsin, could well rise to power, as it had in 1917 and as indeed it would again in 1991. What it by definition could not do was rise to power, let alone entrench itself firmly in power, through democratic means. The Yeltsin government, elected during the Soviet period but ruling past it, lacked democratic legitimacy. Yet it had a great deal of moral certitude. Russia needed to be transformed, the liberal economists who accompanied Yeltsin to power believed, and fast. If that meant holding on to power through means that were not entirely legitimate, as Yeltsin, cheered on by the Moscow intelligentsia and the Clinton administration, held on to power through the 1996 election, so be it. Russia's Democrats came to regard their own victory as utterly inseparable from that of democracy, Furman writes. There was simply no awareness of the straightforward and obvious notion that democracy is affirmed not through the victory of any one party, not even the most democratic, but rather through the cycle in which one party is defeated and an opposition rises to replace it. This concept of a rotation in power was crucial to Furman. It was the ultimate test of a democracy. Many countries in the post-Soviet space had managed to do it, to hold an election in which the opposition actually won. Some, like Belarus and Azerbaijan, had managed to do it only once. Others, like Ukraine and Georgia, a few times. But Russia had not ever managed to do it. There was an important reason, according to Furman, that Yeltsin refused to give up the presidency. Yeltsin himself felt personally implicated in some of the actions he had undertaken as the head of a minority government, specifically the signing of the Belovezh Accords that had dissolved the Soviet Union. Their legality was uncertain, and in their aftermath, Yeltsin could never give up power to the opposition for fear of what would happen to him. When he could no longer function as president, he had to hand power to a successor who could guarantee his legal and personal safety. It was not an anomaly or a terrible mistake that Yeltsin chose a former KGB agent to succeed him. In fact, it was perfectly logical. Writes Furman, the transfer of power from Yeltsin, a leader among Democrats, an associate of Sakharov's, and in certain ways his successor, a man who had once had ample reason to fear the KGB, to a KGB man presents an irony of history. Sadly, it was not. The seeds for the rise of Putin were sown by the Democrats of the early 1990s. That is what Furman saw. Imitation Democracy, the development of Russia's post-Soviet political system, in Ian Dreiblatt's deft and witty translation, is the first of Furman's books, and almost the first of any of his texts, to appear in English. In 1981, the Soviet propaganda house Progress Publishers did issue his Religion and Social Conflicts in the USA, but it is hard to track down a copy. Written in 2009 and published in 2010 as Движение по спирали, Spiral Motion, it is a remarkable account, step by step, detail by detail, of Russia's gradual descent into perdition. Furman begins by stating that, in effect, time is up for the transitionological narrative. It has now been 18 years since the fall of the USSR and the communist system, he writes. That is a very long interval. All the countries that were actually transitioning to democracy over this period have managed to do so. Russia has not. The question is why. The fundamental reason, as we have said, is that the Yeltsin regime began as a minority regime in 1991. But still there would be many ironies and even some potential off-ramps in the years to come. Furman recounts the key events in the decade after Yeltsin came to power in 1991. He describes the dramatic standoff with the Supreme Soviet in the fall of 1993, a standoff in which the Red-Brown alliance in parliament became a defender of Russia's constitutional order, the rise of Chechen separatism and its tragic aftermath, and the dramatic re-election of Yeltsin in 1996. Furman points out, as few others do, the commonality with other imitation democracies across the post-Soviet space, which also saw parliaments disbanded when they crossed the president. And he is alive to other possibilities, such as the brief period of hope during the premiership and then presidential candidacy of Yevgeny Primakov, when it looked like Russia might actually see a transfer of power. But it was not the path that Yeltsin took. Anyone still nostalgic for the Yeltsin years will be well cured of that nostalgia by listening to this book. Throughout Imitation Democracy, you can see the traces of Furman's background as a scholar of religions. He places great emphasis on the cultural and historical background of the peoples he writes about. In a remarkable passage, he describes the many, more or less plausible, stories various countries, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan to the Baltic states, tell about their pre-Soviet democratic histories. Russia lacks this history. It was, since the 16th century, the imperial oppressor, not the colonized oppressed. In the words of the historian Stephen Kotkin, it's been a long time since the kingdom of Novgorod. The formation of a viable democracy was always going to be a challenge. Furman can sometimes seem either naive or absolutist about democracy. For him, in this book, a country either is or is not democratic, according to whether it allows for the consistent transfer of power to an opposition. And whether it is able to do this is largely determined by whether it has been democratic in the past. Democracy comes to seem a bit of a closed circle. There is less room in this view than one would want for the idea that a nominally democratic country can backslide. From the vantage point of 2022, given the state of Viktor Orban's Hungary, for example, Furman's confidence in the Central European states seems premature. The same might be said of the state of democracy in the United States. Furman, writing still in the long wake of the Soviet collapse, believed that all countries were moving inevitably in the same direction, that is, toward democracy. In 2022, that belief seems less self-evident than it did 10 years ago. Furman, in his emphasis on electoral democracy, leaves some things out. Chiefly, as his most eloquent English-language expositor Perry Anderson has written, economics and geopolitics. While Furman is keenly aware of what he calls the market romanticism of the Russian reformers, he does not spend much time on the nature of the Soviet and post-Soviet economies and how these affected the prospects for democratic transition. He is also not that interested, again as Anderson points out, in Russia's position as a geopolitical subject, in its relations, for example, with NATO, or in its actual and imagined interests in the post-Soviet space. Furman died of cancer at the age of 70 in 2011. He did not live to see the large, but not large enough, Russian protests over the fraudulent Duma elections of 2011. He also did not live to see the much larger and more determined protests in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014 that brought down the government of Viktor Yanukovych and triggered the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. In Russia, the aftermath of both the 2011-12 protests and then the Ukraine invasion has been dramatically heightened repression against the tiny political opposition, non-governmental organizations, and journalists. These culminated in the attempted assassination, by poisoning, of the political activist Alexei Navalny in the summer of 2020. As I write, Russia has again, at much greater scale, invaded Ukraine. I do not think Furman would have been surprised by these developments. Even while writing at the height of the relatively vegetarian period of the Tandemocracy, when Dmitrii Medvedev was temporarily president while Putin served as prime minister, He predicted that the system would not be able to reform itself. If Yeltsin could not safely transfer power to the opposition, then the likelihood of Putin being able to do so was that much less. The only way out was an acute crisis. We paid for the stability enjoyed by Russia's 19th-century autocracy, contrasting so starkly with the turbulent history of Western Europe, with the catastrophic events of 1917, Furman writes. It is very likely that the cost of the Putin-era's stability and manageability will similarly be repaid through a coming period of chaos and collapse. For Furman, this was a tragic possibility, but not one without hope. His image of a spiral, which gave the original Russian edition of this book its name, was one in which history advanced, but slowly, and with frequent retreats. One moved along the spiral toward freedom, often backsliding into authoritarianism and unfreedom, but then moved on again. The reason to listen to this wise and intelligent book and to think more deeply, and again, about what went wrong with Russia after 1991, is that there will likely someday be another chance to get it right. Introduction. During the emergence and formation of the post-Soviet Russian state, a view of the new Russia as a society transitioning from the Soviet system to democracy and the market, from communism to capitalism, prevailed uncontroversially over official rhetoric, opinion writing, and scholarship in both Russia and the West. This understanding was only natural, considering that the dismantling of the Soviet system, as in all countries then emerging from communism, was carried out under slogans of democracy and the free market. But if people had rejected communism and proclaimed the goal of democracy, the question remains of what else besides democracy they might have transitioned to. Perhaps this transition proved slower and more laborious for countries like Russia and Kazakhstan than for the Czech Republic and Poland, but that all countries liberating themselves from communism and declaring the goal of democracy were following a similar trajectory seemed beyond dispute. This view of the transitional character of society in post-Soviet Russia, as well as in other post-communist countries, was, however, not just the simplest. It was also the most expedient, politically and psychologically. Post-Soviet rulers unendingly repeated the same idea. The period of transition cannot but be difficult. We cannot demand everything at once. A full-fledged democracy and market cannot be built in a year. We must be patient. This idea of a difficult transition to democracy and the market presented a kind of actualization of the ancient archetype of an exodus from Egyptian bondage to the Promised Land. In the early Soviet era, authorities had justified their actions, and the masses, in turn, had justified the authorities' actions, by arguing that struggle and deprivation were combating the burdensome legacies of Tsarism and capitalism, that it would be necessary to live first for a period in anticipation of socialism, and then later, when it was announced that socialism had been built, with happiness still yet to arrive, of communism. In exactly the same way, the legacy of communism had to be defeated early in the post-Soviet era, and hardships had to once again be endured until our arrival in a new Promised Land. The idea that a difficult transitional period was inevitable provided authorities and elites with a perfect excuse for what they had done, an excuse they could present to themselves, to the international community, and to their own people. There was practically nothing that could not be explained in terms of the transition. Usual norms were suspended, and the well-known injunction not to change horses in midstream was widely applied. This view was convenient not only for post-Soviet leaders, but also for the leaders and societies of the West. It supported the general mood of optimism that had been created by perestroika and the fall of communism, enabling them to turn a blind eye to the obviously undemocratic tendencies of post-Soviet states, which they chalked up to the challenges of transition, thus easing their headaches. When post-Soviet leaders declared that the transition would necessarily be difficult, Western leaders concurred in relief and gladness. The West's broad support for Yeltsin and other pro-democratic Russian leaders, through many acts that were brazenly illegal and undemocratic, was psychologically and morally possible only through a logic of the challenges of transition. Clearly, the expediency and comfort this perspective offered to both post-Soviet and Western elites allowed its obvious conflict with reality to go unnoticed for a long time. It has now been 18 years since the fall of the USSR and the communist system. That is a very long interval. All the countries that were actually transitioning to democracy over this period have managed to do so. Samuel P. Huntington wrote that democracy, a system in which winners alternate with losers based on the free choice of an electorate operating under uniformly applied rules of the game, can establish itself as a norm only after 2 or 3 such rotations. But if we accept Huntington's perspective, which seems indisputable, we will have to acknowledge that the majority of post-Soviet countries, after nearly 2 decades, have failed to take even their first decisive steps down this path. Excluding the Baltics, in the rest of the post-Soviet space, there have been only 5 cases since 1991 of an opposition peacefully coming to power. 3 of these did it in 1994. Moldova, a very peculiar development, once, Belarus once, and Ukraine twice, though the second Ukrainian rotation, marked by the Orange Revolution, can hardly be called peaceful and constitutional. At the same time, the Belarusian rotation, which hypothetically might have marked the start of a transition to democracy, instead marked the electoral victory of Alexander Lukashenko and the creation of a rigid, change-resistant regime of no alternative power that resembles Russia's. The Ukrainian one represented an attempt to create the same kind of regime, promptly washed away in the Orange Revolution. In no other countries, and certainly not in Russia, was there any peaceful constitutional rotation at all. No opposition has ever come to power through peaceful legal means. Nor is that all. If we could at least see in the development of these countries the approach of a first rotation, for example, if in the early 1990s it had seemed out of the question for an opposition party here in Russia to come to power through constitutional means, yet it now seemed a more proximate possibility, then we might say that Russia and countries like it were moving in the same direction as those countries that have successfully made the transition to democracy, albeit more slowly, lagging in their development, which would still only be in its preliminary phase. But this is not the case. Over the course of our political evolution, the possibility of a peaceful constitutional rotation of power has not only failed to grow more likely, it has grown less likely, and at present has shrunk to 0. The logic by which the political systems of Russia and similar countries are developing is by no means one of gradually eliminating the figures inherited from communism and moving toward a democratic model. On the contrary, we can rather say that as these systems have evolved, it is the emergent traces of democracy present during the brief period of actual transition from the late 1980s to the early 1990s that have been eliminated. We have, so to speak, moved along a spiral, with many characteristics of the Soviet system recapitulated in a gentler form. In its political orientation, Russia today, like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and comparable post-Soviet countries, is indisputably closer to late Soviet society than to Russia, or Belarus, at the end of perestroika and the start of the post-Soviet era. Of course, in the longer view, all societies are in transition from one thing to another. For example, the USSR, viewed in the context of the history of the Russian people, could be considered the transitional phase between an autocratic and post-Soviet Russia. Within certain limits, such an approach may even bear fruit. It could productively reveal how certain elements of the post-Soviet system were formed within the Soviet one. Still, its total inadequacy is apparent. Russians and other peoples who joined the USSR, in fact, passed the Soviet period, and then left it, different than they'd entered, continuing to live and evolve. But the USSR itself was destroyed. The USSR had been a living organism, functioning and developing according to its own natural patterns, completing its own life cycle. We cannot understand Soviet history and its logic purely through a model of transition. The same is true for post-Soviet Russian history. In the broader historical perspective, of course, this is a transitional society. The people of Russia have joined the post-Soviet system just as they once joined the Soviet system, and they will exit it substantively changed. But at the same time, post-Soviet Russia is an entire living organism, functioning and developing according to its own logic, advancing through its own unfinished life cycle. In one sense, Russia has already long since transitioned. It has developed its own comparatively stable political and social system, albeit one strikingly different from those found in democratic countries, even in Europe's post-communist countries, with the sole exception of Belarus. This is not a system based on uniform rules of the game by which various political forces can prevail and rise to power, but one in which those already in power always win, and the rules of the game can be changed at the whim of these constant winners. Democratic and legal norms and institutions here play the role of decoration, the camouflage that conceals a different authoritarian configuration of power. But unlike under other forms of authoritarianism, here power finds its basis neither in the physical force of the army as in military dictatorships, nor in ancient tradition as in absolute monarchies, and the democratic camouflage is a requisite immanent element of the system. In fundamental distinction to democratic systems, the Russian system is clearly of a type with a number of others that emerged in the post-Soviet space after the collapse of the USSR, in which a facade of democracy and constitutionality coexists with personal power held by no alternative presidents who rule for as long as they like, most often they like to rule for life, and hand power to whomever they wish. In the following study, we will see many features shared by the Russian and other post-Soviet systems, and the presence within them of a shared structure and logic of development, which speaks to their belonging to a shared species. But this species is distributed across an area much wider than the post-Soviet sphere. Analogous systems have existed and continue to exist in many countries of the erstwhile Third World. Just as it is impossible to show any fundamental species-level distinctions between post-Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Kazakhstan or Belarus, it is equally impossible to show such differences between Russia, or Kazakhstan, and Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, or the regime Hugo Chavez is building in Venezuela. These systems, which have, in my view, been vastly under-theorized, share no self-designation. Indeed, they are all simply democracies. In Russia, the closest thing to a self-designation is sovereign democracy, a term that bubbled up from the depths of the Putin administration but has never been officially adopted. They have no clear name in political science. They are often called managed democracies or imitation democracies. I will use the latter term, but I do not do so insistently. What matters is not the terminology, but the clarity with which we understand this kind of system. If Russia's post-Soviet system belongs to a species alongside its Kazakh and Belarusian, not to mention Algerian, Tunisian, and so on, counterparts, it is certainly a markedly different species from its Soviet predecessor. The Soviet system, too, was marked by elements of imitation democracy, legal and democratic camouflage for the actual mechanisms of governance. The USSR was socialist, but a democracy, bound forever to the Great Rus, yet a federated republic. Run by elections, but by no alternative elections confined to such matters as would not disturb the absolute power of the CPSU, under a constitution enumerating all rights and freedoms. In people's democracies, there was even more such democratic camouflage. Many of them were even quasi-multi-party systems. But these elements played some limited role in all communist systems. The Soviet and other communist systems were based in an ideology of totalitarian dogma that conceptualized its differences from democratic systems in terms of the distinction between true socialist democracy and bourgeois pseudo-democracy. The maintenance of stability in such systems therefore required total ideological control by the state. As I will attempt to demonstrate, however, while the Soviet and post-Soviet systems share much in the logic by which they function and develop, notwithstanding many additional ideological and other.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?